Okay, hi everyone. Thank you for joining us tonight for our final RiverWatch Fall Speaker Series. For those of you who are new to the Illinois RiverWatch Network, RiverWatch is a citizen science organization that trains volunteers to monitor water quality in their own communities. The mission of RiverWatch is to safeguard the future of Illinois rivers and streams through stewardship, education, and sound science. Before we get started, I ask that you keep your microphone muted during the presentation to limit the distractions. There will be a Q&A session following the presentation. If you have any questions you would like to ask, you can either put it into the chat box and Dr. Zimmermann can answer them at the end of her talk, or you can save it and ask it aloud during the Q&A session. Now I would like to welcome Dr. Julie Zimmermann, professor and the chair of the Anthropology Department of Southern Illinois University in Edwardsville. Dr. Zimmermann received her PhD from New York University, where she studied Midwestern archaeology with a focus on zoo archaeology. She started at SIUE in the fall of 2000, where she teaches courses on prehistory and archaeological methods and theory, and also conducts research on Native American prehistory of the American bottom. Please welcome Dr. Julie Zimmermann.
Thank you, Hannah, for asking me. I'm gonna go ahead and share my screen. Is everyone looking at my PowerPoint? Hannah, if you nod, I'll know. Yes, good, thank you. Okay. All right, so knowing that this group is into water, I wanted to emphasize what I can about subsistence ecology of the people, but I'm also going to give you a dizzying 15,000 year tour of Native American history, archaeology in our area. And so I did call it, my subtitle was before 1492, so I didn't want you to think I was going to like talk about Mark Twain or something. But also, if I get to, I'm going to try to monitor my my time here. I want to go back to the first evidence of Native American occupation, which we call Clovis, and I certainly want to make it to Cahokia. I might make it past 1492 up until, maybe even 1830, so we'll see what happens. All right, so to start with, I want to say, and I'll just assume, again, I know that you are citizen scientists who are interested in water and interested in the river, but I'll just assume kind of complete ignorance because it's always safer as a speaker to do that. So on the map here, on the left here, we have a map of the natural zones of Illinois. And on the right, we have a map of our modern water locations. So the first thing you see when you compare these is, okay, so if on our map here on the left, if yellow is prairie, then I think probably everyone watching this knows that the green would be forest, all right? And so it's pretty obvious to see that the forested areas are following the rivers. And probably most of you watching know that prairies are fire dependent. And so that is why prairies are found in the areas away from the rivers in the state of Illinois. So the point I want to make here is, of course, where people live depends upon they need access to food and water. And so the primary place, the best place to get the food and water for a Native American was actually going to be in those green areas, the forested areas. There aren't that many sites found in the prairie areas. And think about what you know about those prairie sods, how deep they were and impenetrable those grasses were. So with using stone tools, agricultural systems were not, Native American agricultural systems were not well suited to those prairie areas. It would have been it would have been very difficult to plow up that prairie if you didn't have the steel plow. Of course, they would have gone out into the prairies to hunt. The other thing I want to point out here before we go on is that on the map that you see on the right, I hope everyone knows that every single lake you see on that map is what I would call fake. So a human-made lake. And in our infinite wisdom, you know, settlers of the 1800s drained most of the lakes that would have been found here in the backwaters of the Mississippi River. So I'm going to I'm mostly going to focus tonight on the American Bottom, which is the floodplain from approximately of the Mississippi River, from approximately Alton down to where the Kaskaskia comes in. I will refer to the Illinois River Valley also, but mostly I'm going to focus on the American Bottom. And the lower Illinois Valley and the American Bottom here would have been covered with backwater lakes during at least the last, I don't know, 4,000 years or so at least. Okay, so just bear that in mind, and I'll come back to that thought. I wanted to start with the first evidence of occupation by Native Americans and by the way, this is Native American Heritage Month, so let me underline that I am talking about Native American history here. Okay, Native American use of this land for thousands of years. So when we use this term Paleo Indians, we're referring to, this is a term that goes back in the archaeological literature, I think to the 1940s. So it's not today we might not like the term doesn't sound old Indians doesn't sound very good, but we're referring to the first known and first verified absolute, no one can deny that there were Native Americans here during what we call Paleo Indian period. And there may have been Native Americans here before that, but there's some debate over that. So in the state of Illinois, our best evidence is for Clovis people, what we call Clovis, C-L-O-V-I-S. Sorry, I didn't put on the slide here. And that's a Clovis spear point that you see on the upper left here, very identifiable by this fluted point. And I put a date here of 10,000 BC, but I'm comfortable saying 15,000 years ago. Again, some archaeologists would like to put a date of maybe 30,000 years ago. And of course, Native American belief might be that people were always here, or they might prefer that 30,000 year ago date. But just to be conservative, let's say in the last 12,000 years, there's no doubt about it that Native Americans are living in this area. And on the right here, I have, I've put a map from the Illinois State Museum. And I apologize right now, I didn't have time to, when I'm teaching, it takes so long to put together PowerPoints. I don't always have the references on where I'm getting the images from. And so I'm going to tell you that this one on the right is from the Illinois State Museum, and it's showing you site locations. Here's the American Bottom here. If you can see, here's the Missouri River coming in, here's the Mississippi River. And so this area that you see in here is the American Bottom. And this is this line here is the bluff line. Okay, this is the county line between St. Clair and Madison County here. So Cahokia would be approximately right there. And I'm going to say this map is, I'm going to say it might be like 20 years old at least. So it doesn't show all the Paleo Indian sites known in the area, but this pattern is clear. There are at least 25 Paleo Indian sites known in the St. Louis area. And what do you immediately see when you look at this map? Where are those yellow dots? Not a single one of them is down here in the floodplain. So given our focus here on the river, I want to emphasize that Paleo Indians are probably, these are short-term occupations. We know this because the chert, the stone from which they're making these spear points, it suggests that they're moving actually all across this, like a triangular pattern from the American Bottom area up towards Chicago, down towards the Wabash Valley and back over again. And our stereotype, so they're staying in the uplands. And you can imagine as the glaciers are retreating, this floodplain is probably not very stable. So even if they're going down into it, who knows whether or not it's even safe. But if there are periods when they're going down and using that floodplain, surely those sites have been destroyed or deeply buried. And remember, there are also these incredible windstorms blowing up at the end of the Ice Age. We're blowing the floodplain soils up to the uplands. This would be not a good place to be. The closest to a site that's been found in the floodplain is actually, this is in the lower right hand corner. This is the base of a fluted point. So it's a late Paleo Indian point. Maybe it's 10,000 years old or something like that. And it was found at a site we've been excavating on campus the Gehring site. It's at the foot of the bluff in the SIUE campus on what is today called Stadium Road, or formerly called Bluff Road, between the soccer fields. And that's like right about in here, right at the foot of the bluff. And my friend Brad Koldehoff studies stone tools and has looked at, knows more about Clovis points than anybody. And he says a very almost identical point was found here at the base of the bluff, where Wood River comes out into the floodplain. And this chert this is made out of, by the way, you can see it's a pink green chert, is called Fern Glen chert, which comes from down around Valmeyer. The chert is found in limestone outcroppings, and sometimes you can find nodules in creeks. And that Fern Glen chert comes from down around Valmeyer in the Southern American bottom. So I put a picture here of Paleo Indians hunting mammoth. I want to point out there's no evidence for mammoth in this area. Plenty of mastodon sites, right? Hundreds of mastodon sites have been found in the state of Illinois. But as I had a professor in graduate school, Howard Winters, late great Howard Winters, used to say, not a single one of them had produced artifacts except for the Kimswick site, which is down and across the river. And what is, they call it the Kimswick site, but it's Mastodon State Historic Site, which is actually in Imperial, Missouri, near Kimswick. A number of mastodon remains have been found in that area where I grew up. But the one skeleton had Clovis, a couple Clovis points and flakes in it, showing that at least one mastodon once was, if not killed by people, probably because they lost their Clovis points in the mastodon, they butchered it and ate it. Looks pretty clear from the evidence there. So I'm going to say that's kind of seems like a unique site. There's no other site known like that in this area. And so the theory is that they're actually maybe following caribou herds around the state. That's a possibility. It's the end of the Ice Age, but we actually have no direct evidence for that. None of these Paleo Indian sites that you're looking at here have produced any animal bones to show us exactly what they are really eating. Okay. The last point I want to make about, no pun intended, point about the chert is that the chert that it was found over here at the Kimswick site is not the same chert we find on this side of the river. And so they are not crossing that river. That river is seems to be impassable at this where we are. Okay. All right. So moving on right into what we call the Archaic Period. This is a big chunk of time, 8,000 to 1,000 BC. And so archaeologists like to divide stuff into three. We actually divide that into early, middle, and late Archaic, but I'm going to lump most of it together for our purposes. By this point, the environment is essentially modern, and they stop making the Clovis points, and you see a huge variety of different spear point styles. And we're not sure exactly how to interpret that, but there's also evidence for there's plenty of great evidence for deer hunting. So plenty of, you see on the top right here, a map showing Archaic Period sites in the American bottom. And there are plenty of them, and plenty of them produced animal bones, lots of deer bones, and lots of plant remains that I'm going to talk about in a minute. But I'm going to point out hickory nuts, for example. Archaic people love hickory nuts. So, and walnuts. So when you think of archaic people, think of deer hunters who love nuts. And by the end of Archaic Period, they actually domesticate some plants, which I'm going to talk about in a second. Before I go on, I want to point out that even though the sites here seem to be clustering along the foot of the bluff, bear in mind that there is survey bias, and where archaeologists find sites, we find sites where we look for them. We do not find sites where we don't look for them. And lots of archaeologists have been paid to look for sites where where 255 went in. Okay, so a lot of these dots you're seeing here are along Highway 255. A lot of this floodplain has not necessarily been surveyed. A lot of it is under urban development as well. All right, so I wanted to mention the Coster site because it's a very famous site in the lower Illinois Valley with occupation going from historic period. You see this cool historic limestone farmhouse here. And as archaeologists excavated the site from the Center for American Archaeology in Campbellsville. Go visit if you haven't before, although I think the museum is closed for repairs right now. at the Campsville site, starting at the ground surface, they're finding, I think, Mississippian, like Cahokia and stuff at the ground surface. And you can see how deep they dug. They stopped digging, not because they stopped finding stuff, but because they were hitting water. And at the time, they didn't have the resources to continue excavating the sites. So the deepest occupation levels, there were early Archaic period, going back to like 8,000 years ago or something like that. So pretty incredible site. In the lower Illinois Valley near Eldred, Illinois. And I want to mention evidence for dog burials. So 3 different dog burials found there. So these are the oldest known dog burials in the Americas. And probably those Paleo Indians brought dogs with them. Maybe they were pulling sleds coming from Siberia. And so you'll notice here that they did not eat this dog. They chose to bury it like a member of the family. So this is the only domesticated animal that Native Americans in this area ever had. So wanted to point that out. Okay, so really important for late Archaic. Yes, they did a lot of deer hunting and they loved nuts, hickory nuts especially, but it's during the late Archaic period, you know, at least 4,000 years ago, maybe 6,000 years ago, 4,000 years ago, let's say, when those backwater lakes form. And so people start living around, the Native Americans started settling around them at what we call base camps for longer periods of time, maybe several months out of the year. And living in those base camps for longer periods, they start planting seeds, saving seeds over the winter and planting them. And as you do that, natural selection is taken over by artificial selection, and people are maybe not on purpose, they're saving seeds on purpose and planting them on purpose, but they are unintentionally selecting for, they are artificially but unintentionally selecting for thinner seed coats. While domesticated seeds don't need a thick seed coat like a wild seed does. Bigger seeds, because the bigger the seed, the more energy for the seedling when they plant that seed. And so we're talking about microscopic differences. People are not intentionally selecting for thinner seed coats and bigger seeds. It just happens. What we see in this is a diorama that was just recently removed from the Illinois State Museum of what this might have looked like. And you see this looks like a little squash here. And this looks to me like sunflower plants. So I want to mention that we can see that as on the right, we see that map of the American bottom showing you those backwater lakes that would have been here. And of course, the only one left today is Horseshoe Lake. All right. But for example, where it says Mitchell here, these are Mississippian period sites with the red dots, so you can ignore them. But Granite City is here, and there was a lake there. It's not there anymore. Okay. So the only one of these backwater lakes, these are ancient river channels, right, where the river used to run and left a big scour behind that would flood every year. And with these annual floods, these lakes would fill with fish. They'd be incredibly rich places to live and to camp around and start planting your seeds for your gardens. And so on the left there, we can see a little chart of what I've put together, showing you the percentage of sites in the floodplain of the American bottom. Paleo Indian, none. Late Archaic or early Archaic, about 15, middle Archaic, about 20. By the late Archaic, something like 1/3 of the sites, almost 35%, are found on the floodplains. So still the majority of sites are in the uplands, but people are starting to use the floodplains more and more. So what are these plants that they have domesticated? I'm going to say top left, we're looking at a wild squash. This is Cucurbita Texana, like Texas. Probably look how thin that shell is on that wild squash. There really is not much of an edible rind, and they were probably using those squashes for fish that floats. And if you know anything about, if you've ever gardened and composted, you know that squashes pretty much grow themselves and probably just about could have domesticated themselves. Okay, people, yes, have to be using them, but squashes are so easily, they're all of these are what a botanist would call weedy plants. There's plants to a botanist, a weed's not a plant that grows where you don't want it, like it is to the rest of us. To a botanist, Weedy plants are plants that grow well in disturbed areas. And these anthropogenic habitats, these human disturbed environments around these base camps, around these backwater lakes are perfect disturbed environments. And these are all floodplain weeds, except for bottom right is the only one that most of you will probably recognize, maybe many of you, and that is sunflower. So sunflower is an upland plant, but the rest are, they're all weedy plants. The other three here are floodplain weeds. Top right is Iva annua, or marsh elder sumpweed. Bottom left is Chenopodium berlandieri, which is a different, if you've tried quinoa at the, in the grain section of your grocery store, quinoa is a domesticated seed that comes from South America, the Andes. But we have our own, that's Chenopodium quinoa is the genus species of quinoa, but our local species is Chenopodium berlandieri. So that is, all four of these plants are domesticated here about 4,000 years ago during the late Archaic period. And while they're probably just using those squashes for fish floats at this time, maybe they're eating the seeds. On the other plants that we're looking at here, the seeds would be edible. On the Chenopodium and the sumpweed, the greens would be edible. So yeah, that they're growing these plants in gardens now. And the archaeologist Bruce Smith has done a lot of research in this area, worked at the Smithsonian for decades. And so what we're looking at here is how to demonstrate two different ecotones, oak savanna and oak hickory forest zones. And notice how in the dots, the spots there that you see are marking sites that have some of the earliest evidence of plant domestication. And notice that those ecotones kind of come together almost right here in the American bottom. And certainly lower Illinois Valley is an important area of with early evidence of early plant domestication. In this map, Bruce Smith has added cultural zones on top of that. So this is like one spear point area, and this is another spear point area. So you've got two different cultural zones overlapping each other, where these pretty close to where these two different eco zones come in. And I want to emphasize here we are in the American bottom. Here's the lower Illinois Valley. This is a gateway 4,000 years ago, just like it was historically. Okay. So consider that as people are trading, I meant to say, yeah, the Archaic period, people aren't moving around as much as they did, to make clear, they've got much smaller territories than they did during Paleo Indian. But they're trading materials, and they're probably exchanging marriage partners between cultural groups. And along with the artifact trade and the gene flow, they're trading seeds as well. So, okay. And I want to say also, fishing is increasingly my specialty, being zooarchaeology, the archaeology of animal bones. I'm not going to talk a whole lot about the animal bones because it gets, okay, deer, and then through time, more fish. So deer and fish, deer and fish, deer and fish. At some point, it's more fish and deer, fish and deer, fish and deer, fish and deer. So deer provide lots of resources, from not just the meat and the marrow, but also the bones for tools, and the hide for clothing, and leather, and the antlers for making tools. Fish provide meat. And again, those backwater lakes are going to provide virtually inexhaustible catch, the fish stock there would be replenished every time it floods. And I want to point out here that the primary species that they're going after are members of the catfish family, what you see in this hand here on the lower right. Also, bowfin is not a fish that we would eat today, but that's a fish that they were eating a lot of. Members of the sucker family, not just buffalo, but also red horse, for example. And then members of the sunfish family, the bluegills and other little sunfishes, and the small and largemouth bass also. Those are the most important, the most commonly eaten. And I chose a picture of a little tiny fish to emphasize to you that although we do occasionally find fish hooks, such as this bonefish hook that you see top left, they're mostly eating lots of little fish, okay? And it looks, so we think that they're probably netting fish, Again, we think that they're using those gourds for float weights. But they could also, as these backwater lakes are drying up in the spring after a flood, brings in new fish, and as the floods dry up, you could probably go in there and pick up those fish with your bare hands. Having said that, remember, we have an excavation bias where we've done a lot of work along, for example, where 255 went in. We've done a lot of work along the base of the bluff. So the only site that's really been excavated by professional archaeologists, the East St. Louis site, I haven't had a chance, that was just done with the New Mississippi River Bridge. I haven't had a chance to look at the fauna remains found on that site, but the animal bones that came from the Fish Lake site, which is out closer to the river near the Jefferson Barracks Bridge, that from the late woodland occupation produced some, like, looks like 40-pound catfish, blue catfish and flathead, and other like basses and stuff in the 5-pound size range. So bigger fish coming from sites closer to the river. So again, it looks like they're eating lots of little fish, but that might be partly due to the bias of looking at sites closer to the bluff. Okay, I want to, moving on into what we call Woodland Period. Again, we divide into early, middle, late. This map we see in the top right here shows a lot more sites. This is early, middle, late woodland all smashed onto one map, but a lot more sites over a much shorter period of time. So there really is the population is bigger than it was during archaic periods. The big innovation of early woodland is pottery. And that is all I want to say about early woodland. If we look at that site distribution again, you can see lots more sites out in the floodplain. You see this funny shape here is Horseshoe Lake. And sure, there are lots of sites around Horseshoe Lake, but again, archaeologists were paid to look for sites surveying around Horseshoe Lake. So again, there's definitely some survey and excavation bias when you look at these maps. Okay. All right, next I want to talk about middle woodland. So what's also known as Hopewell, relatively short period of time here, let's say 150 BC to 8300. This map that we're looking on the left here is from a very old publication, Thorne Duell, who was director of Illinois State Museum, wrote an book, Hopewellian Communities in Illinois, came out in 1952, and this is his map. Those circles that you see there are showing you middle woodland mounds. So I want to emphasize that the middle woodland people are mound builders, the Hopewell Mounds, they actually named for Hopewell, Ohio. So lots of mounds along in the Mississippi Valley, but really in the Illinois Valley, Central Illinois Valley, Lower Illinois Valley. This is a cultural tradition along the Illinois Valley called the Havana tradition, named for a site in Havana, Illinois, up near Lewiston, Havana, where Dixon Mounds is. There's a separate tradition called Crab Orchard down in Southern Illinois. Notice here in the American bottom, it shows one mound, and actually that has been shown not to be a real mound. That is actually, I'm pretty sure, on the SIUE campus. So whereas the American bottom with Cahokia as the capital 1,000 years ago, Mississippian period is like the center of the world for Native Americans of those related cultures. 2,000 years ago, middle woodland, Hopewell, this is the American bottom's a backwater. Have been referred to by my colleague Andrew Fortier, who made this map on the right, as the land between two traditions. So we're between the Havana tradition, we're between the Crab Orchard tradition. We mostly show Havana pottery, but some Crab Orchard as well. So it's kind of like a place where it's the land between two traditions. I want to call it maybe a no man's land. Having said that, there are sites here. You can see the sites, more and more use of the floodplain. And if you look at the sites through time, they're actually start in the Northern American bottom and work their way to the Southern American bottom. And the thought is that, in fact, these are settlers who are coming from the Lower Illinois Valley and working their way down to the Southern American bottom. And then they leave around 8300. They pretty much abandon the American bottom for 50 years or so, probably. Remember, they're living in the floodplain quite often, and probably it's a period of flooding. So they leave. The river has been in its modern bed for about 2,000 years. So it's there is evidence for flooding after that time, and people leave. So I wanted to just point out in those burial mounds, you find really incredible, beautiful Hopewell artifacts. These people are great artists. And you can look at these and say, these artifacts are telling a story about rivers, but I want to say they are telling a story about cosmology. These artifacts are telling a story about the origins of the world for these Native Americans. So the beaver is an earth diver in the Native American or in an Algonquin Native American origin story. Little animals, it's a water world, and the little earth divers dive down one by one and try to bring up water to earth, to start the world. And finally, the fourth animal is a successful one and slaps on the back of the turtle. And that's how the world becomes Turtle Island for many Native Americans of the Eastern Woodlands. So that beautiful little beaver that you see there is telling that origin story. And notice he's got an actual beaver tooth is carved for his teeth. And he's got these beautiful little pearl eyes. These two artifacts here, and that was found in the Illinois Valley. These two artifacts here also from the Illinois Valley. All of these found in mounds. And these are showing roseate spoonbills. Roseate spoonbills are not from this area. A roseate spoonbill was actually found in a burial mound, buried with a human in the Illinois Valley from this time period. But roseate spoonbills are native to like the Everglades area. And this particular, this is a carved mussel up here on the right. And this little tiny bit of beak sculpture here tells you what species of mussel this is. And I forget the name of it, but this species of mussels is found in one river valley in Georgia that is where the roseate spoonbill is actually from. So while so people up here have never seen roseate spoonbills. People in Illinois have never seen them, except occasionally maybe you get a one lost roseate spoonbill flew in, or maybe its dead body was traded up here, or maybe it was traded up here alive. But this little mussel shell, sorry, it's not marine, freshwater mussel shell, did not swim up here. It was carved in Georgia and traded up here. So these water is very important to these people, as everybody, these mounds in the floodplain are often built to, it's thought to look like when it floods, to look like the earth rising up out of that water world, to recreate that origin story. So I said that here in the American bottom, we're in kind of a no man's land. We have no burial mounds, but on the site we've been excavating on the SAU campus, the Gehring site, there actually are some really cool trade items there, such as these, including obsidian, top right, bear tooth here. This chert here is from Southern Illinois. It's called Cobden chert. And Middle Woodland people love quartz crystals. And this beautiful red painted pottery from 2,000 years ago is very rare for the American bottom, much more typical Hopewell pottery from the Illinois Valley. So we've got some special stuff that we're finding on campus, including this cool little figurine. And this is kind of a unique little figurine, and that's more typical for Middle Woodland. And in burial mounds, you find fancy ones like this one here in the Illinois Valley. In our area, more commonly, you would find what's called the Casper the ghost figurine. You can see why bottom left, it just looks like little stubs for arms and a stump for a head, and usually no legs. So the one we found on campus is kind of a hybrid of these two styles, where somebody spent a lot of time working on these legs, and then they got to the waist and they're like, oh shit, I'm never gonna get this right. And they just finished it off in the Casper the ghost style. So yeah. All right. So I want to stress here, by this point, they're in their gardens. They are growing. I mentioned those 4 domesticates going back to 4,000 years ago, but by this point, they're growing a bunch of different plants in their gardens, including what we call the Eastern Agricultural Complex. These are native plants, native to this region, and domesticated right here. So a native agricultural, horticultural system that begins 4,000 years ago. So by Middle Woodland, they're still growing the Chenopodium that I mentioned. And I mentioned earlier the Iva annua, number 5, and the Helianthus here, number 6, and the Cucurbita pepo, number 7. But they are also growing a species of knotweed, erect knotweed. They're also growing maygrass, which is not actually native to this area, but native to like Arkansas, somewhere to the south of us. They're growing little barley, They're growing, I already mentioned silage. So most of these plants ripen in the fall. The Maygrass and little barley are really important because they ripen in the spring when you've run out of your other food. That's a really critical to have these plants to eat at that time. And the sunflower, you can still buy sunflower oil at the grocery store today. The sunflower is an important source of oil. So is that sumpweed. The other plants are starchy plants. And by the way, they are much healthier than a lot of the stuff the grains that we eat today. I didn't put a nutrition chart in here, but they're much healthier than corn, for example. So notice no corn. Okay. Middle woodland people, once upon a time, it was thought they must have been growing corn to build these beautiful mounds and have this incredible fancy artifacts and beautiful artifacts that they're trading. But no, we know now that I'm going to say next to zero evidence. And I think that we have 2 sites. We used to have 3. One of them was just proven was from the American bottom, thought that they had domesticated corn dating the middle woodland period. And it was just demonstrated that no, that in fact was not even corn. So I'm going to say Hopewellians did not eat corn. Okay. But they did grow all these plants, these native plants in their gardens. And I might mention that women are doing this work. Most likely the Native American women were the farmers. The men would go out hunting and go to war and sit around and talk. But women were the ones doing the plant domestication, almost certainly. Okay. All right. So late woodland period, AD 300 to 1050, depending upon how you define it. I want to mention an important innovation. If you can see this rock art here is from Piney Creek rock art site in Illinois, down south of us a couple hours. I'm blanking to think of the next closest town, like Campbell Hill, I think. Cool rock art site though, go visit it, lovely place to hike. And what do you see here? This thing here is a bow and an arrow. And this is a guy shooting a bow and arrow. Now I want to point in this rock art here, he's shooting at this other person who appears to have a shield. So this rock art is almost certainly dates the Mississippian period. So late woodland people get the bow and arrow. It comes into the area from the northwest, probably around AD 800. But they are not, it makes deer hunting, I'm sure easier for a while at least. But there's no evidence for violence against other people until Mississippian period. The other thing I want to say is then around AD 900, that's when you start to find evidence of corn. So AD 900 is the beginning of a warm, wet period, which is great for growing corn. Corn has to be, corn is a tropical plant coming from Mexico. To come up with varieties that are adapted to the day length we have here. Our days are longer than they are in Mexico, and the day lengths have to be short enough for the corn to ripen. And that's the way it works in Mexico. So to come up with varieties that will work here, you had to come up with the varieties that were adapted to the longer day length. So otherwise they would ripen, but by the time the days were short enough, there'd be killing frosts like we've been having. It would kill your corn crop. Okay, so by 8900, they have a corn variety that can grow in this area, and this is in this day length, and this is a warm, wet period that is great for growing corn. So by 8900, within that first century of growing corn, it becomes really important. And I want to say they still grow their native plants. It does not ever in this area. They never, in some places, they quit growing all the stuff they were growing. They just grow corn and later beans and squash, but not here. They keep growing those native plants, but that corn becomes a big part of the diet. And I'm going to say if corn had not been here, if they had not been growing corn, I don't think they could have fed all the people coming to Cahokia. If not for that warm, wet period, I don't think they could have fed all the people who are coming to Cahokia. So some people call this period 8900 to 1050 the emergent Mississippian period, because we do start to see things that suggest the culture's becoming more complex. For example, this is the range site, and when we look at this is down near Dupo, where Highway 255 went through. And these are all these rectangular things you see here. Those are houses. And then there's a plaza area here in the center with a big structure and a post in the middle and storage pits where they're storing communal foods. This is basically the kind of the layout of Cahokia. And we know that there's a big village at Cahokia at this time as well. Okay. And something happens around AD 1050 that big village at Cahokia becomes a big city. So here we're looking at a map of Mississippian sites on the top left. Again, lots of sites now, again, down in the floodplains, but also farmsteads out in the uplands. When we look at Cahokia, Cahokia has something like 120 mounds. East St. Louis had something like 50. Across the river to St. Louis, 25 or more, depending upon the counts that you look at and what you consider to be part of the same group. I think we should consider this to be one great big site during Mississippian period. And people, I want to emphasize that there's huge population growth at this time. And it's not because people are having, I mean, maybe they're having more babies, but that's not the only reason why. It's because of immigration. There are entire villages that are being built out by immigrants out around O'Fallon, what Tim Pocketot from University of Illinois calls the Richland Complex. So you have to, really emphasize that this is Cahokia is there. Yes, there are people here already. There have probably been immigrants coming to this area throughout the emergent Mississippian period, but this really increases dramatically during the Mississippian period. Something like 33% of people coming to Cahokia, people living at Cahokia and in the region appear to be immigrant. Okay. So we can take a minute here and just like look at this beautiful reconstruction. This is a painting by Bill Eiseminger, who is an archaeologist who worked at Cahokia for 50 years and knows as much about Cahokia as more than I will ever know. And so like I want to emphasize Cahokia has a history. This is not what it looked like at AD 1050. This is what it looked like around AD 1200, because we see this palisade is built. We see Monk's Mound is built. Here's what today where 5570 goes through. This is where Cahokia Creek went through. This is Horseshoe Lake over here. And remember, if we go back up to this is Cahokia Creek here. You could follow this creek on out to East St. Louis and out to the river, or you could go north up. It goes skirts along the base of the bluff, and where the SIUE campus is where it would have come out of the uplands. And you could follow it on up to Hamel and Warden area. So there are people living probably all along here. And certainly farmsteads out in the rural, what would have been rural then as well, growing corn for Cahokia. Thinking about our emphasis on the water, where you see these, this is actually an ancient river channel over here, just like Horseshoe Lake is. So to the right, that's an ancient river channel. It's left a backwater lake behind. There's still a little bit of that left. But these other water features you see are borrow pits where they're digging up the dirt to build these mounds. And I wouldn't be at all surprised if they're keeping if they're keeping fish in those ponds. I didn't mention ducks earlier because ducks are never important in the diet the way fish and deer are. But just remember there are over 24 species of ducks that fly through this area, and of course geese and swans. So there are other resources that are really critical to these backwater habitats. Yeah, okay. So I want to emphasize that migrants helped build Cahokia. Why did they come? If I'm going to stop in 6 minutes, I'm not going to make it to 1830s, but why did they come? I'm going to say they're coming not because this is a great place to grow corn. Corn feeds them and is necessary to feed these people who are coming. But I think they're coming for cosmological, religious kinds of reasons. And so here, for example, are some depictions. Like this is a picture cave, which is actually near Warrensburg, Missouri. And you see this character with the human head earring. Look at this carved figurine. This red stone comes from the same area, but this is apparently being made at a workshop in East St. Louis or Cahokia, somewhere in the Cahokian, greater Cahokian area. And you notice this character is wearing human head earrings. So, and we find the actual human head earrings in burials dating to this time period. So there's some kind of a cult, I'm going to call it a religion, based upon about a guy, a hero who's wearing human head earrings. And we know a story told by the Ho-Chunk Indians to the anthropologist Paul Radin 100 years ago about a great hero who wore human head earrings named Redhorn. So if we had time, I would tell that story, but I don't. So if you want to hear me tell that story, take the next tour that I do of Cahokia, or I'm supposed to give a lecture there January 16th, I think. I want to say not just all male figurines, though. These beautiful female figurines, the male figurines are found all over the place, hundreds of 500 miles away. The female figurines tend to be found here in the American Bottom or Illinois Valley or to the Boot Heel of Missouri, so a much smaller area. They're keeping these beautiful female figurines at home. And notice the agricultural themes present there. This woman is hoeing into the back of this mythological serpent creature whose tail comes around her back and turns into a gourd vine. It's interesting that they chose to depict a Mexican gourd, though, not our native gourds. Oh, which, by the way, if you like acorn squash and zucchini, I think they are the descendants of the squashes that were domesticated here 4,000 years ago. And here, this on the right here, there's argument among archaeologists whether this woman is holding up 2 corn stalks in her hands. Gail Fritz and Natalie Mueller from WashU say that it's not corn. These women, they knew how to carve corn, and this is not corn, but I don't know what else it would be. And notice, though, she's got coming off of her ear here, she's got a sunflower, beautifully made sunflower head seed, you know, the head of flower. Okay, so why did they leave? And I know that I'm going to say the leaving starts by AD 1200, around the time they build that wall around Cahokia. So by the time Cahokia is really abandoned by 1350, it's not just environmental problems, but I'm sorry, I'm an ecologist at heart, and I'm going to also, I'm sure they're leaving for religious reasons, just like they came for religious reasons. I'm sure they're leaving for social reasons, just like they came for social reasons. But environment, just like it made it possible to have that warm, wet period, the ending of that warm, wet period now makes it harder to keep this big city going. So deforestation would be a thing, soil depletion, they're growing corn without beans, no beans grown in Cahokia. We need that for the amino acid, or in your diet, you need it for the amino acid balance, but in the soils you need, because the corn is nitrogen depleting and the beans add nitrogen back to the soil. I think overhunting would have been a problem. And you see articles coming out saying evidence of floods and then evidence of drought. And, you know, okay, it is goes from being a warm, wet period to a cool, dry period. So I think all of these things are happening. And then, yes, I'm going to say it. I think the final straw, if you're like, man, stuff's going wrong here. I've been working my butt off and I'm like running out, like things are not going right here. Then imagine an earthquake came. What we're looking at the right here is the footprint of the New Madrid earthquakes of 1895. This is not even the big one of 1811, 1812. This is 1895. And so this is yellow areas where shaking was felt. The red area is the area of damage. Look how it overlaps with this area to the left. I want to emphasize it's not just Cahokia that it's abandoned. It's a big, huge area that looks strangely like the footprint of this earthquake footprint. So I don't think this is, I think people are already people are already leaving. I think this is just kind of like a last straw to go, okay, I'm out of here. And we know that these earthquakes are happening every 500 years, plus or minus 200 or 300, because of evidence on archaeological sites. And believe me, the earthquakes of 1811 and 1812 were horrific. And here are some 19th century drawings of what that was like. The river running in the opposite direction. I'd be like, I'm out of here. Okay. So I think I was told to speak for 35 to 50 minutes and it is now 7:50. So I will just look at these last two maps here and say that so Cahokia is effectively abandoned when the next group of people come in. There may be a little bit of overlap between Cahokians and what we call Oneota, coming from like probably bison hunters coming from the north, the plains. And then in the 1600s is when the Illini come in. And so Illinois is named for the Illini. It's in the 1600s, the archaeological record shows they come in. And that is who Marquette and Joliet, the first Europeans to come through what is now the state of Illinois, went down the Mississippi and back up the Illinois River. They encountered a village of Kaskaskian Indians who are an Illini tribe up here at Starved Rock, and Missouri State Park, Illinois Village. I forget what tribe, but another tribe of Illinois Indians over at what is today the border of Missouri and Iowa on the other side of the river. And of course, they saw the cool Piasaw, which didn't look anything like that thing on the top right. It looked like this thing on the bottom left, and it had no wings. And I will stop talking there.
Okay, thank you for that. It was great, like all of your talks.
Thank you. Yes.
If anybody has any questions, you guys can put them in the chat or ask them out loud. I'll start it off. Where did do we know where the people from Cahokia went after they left?
That's a great question. So I'm going to say the Osage filled up most of the state of Missouri during the historic period before Indian Removal Act of 1830. Well, Indian Removal Act was really more affecting Native Americans east of the Mississippi than west, but nevertheless, okay. So the Osage occupied most of the state of Missouri, and they consider themselves to be descendants of Cahokians, and the related tribes to the Osage, the Omaha and the Kaw and the Quapaw and the Ponca, I think. They are all related, and probably Cahokia was multi-ethnic, right? It's a 33% immigrant. There are people probably that looks like they're coming from what is today like southern Indiana and Missouri and adjacent states, and there's abundant interaction between Cahokia and states as far away as Oklahoma and Georgia. So I think when Cahokia is abandoned, yes, I think Osage and their relatives may be the original Cahokians, and maybe they leave and go across the river. But I'm sorry, the question popped up. I'll answer that in a second. But I think as Cahokia is being abandoned, starting AD 1200, I think people are going back to where they came from, okay, which could be, places from Oklahoma to Georgia, okay. And the Red Horn story that I told you, it was actually Glenn, again, the Ho-Chunk told that to culture anthropologist Paul Radin, and the Ho-Chunk live up around Wisconsin. So they are related. They are Siouan speaking groups. The Ho-Chunk, just like the Osage and their relatives, but they're different groups. So yeah, does that answer your question? Okay, so the question in the chat was, can I say a little bit more about the Oneota? It seems like they're skipped over in what I've read. Is there a reason why? Well, the Oneota are going to say are kind of confusing. So again, it looks like the Oneota might be coming from like Iowa, and they might be buffalo hunters. I don't have, I tried, I swear I cut this PowerPoint back considerably. So I don't have any maps to show you what I'm talking about, but they might be following, bison might be moving into northern Illinois at this time, and the Oneota might be following them like around the time of the fall of Cahokia. And there are plenty of Oneota sites like farther north in the Illinois Valley where like around Dixon Mounds, where it looks like there's a lot of evidence of violence up there. And but at the same time, it looks they're late. It's just really confusing. There are people there before Cahokians come into the central Illinois Valley. Cahokians come up there and build sites, and then the Oneota come in, and you'd think that they're the ones fighting, but yet they seem to be living in the same village together, and there's no evidence of fighting in the village. So it's really uncertain. There's very little evidence of Oneota in the American bottom. There are literally like 4 sites that have been found. There's a little bit of evidence from Cahokia itself. The range site I mentioned has some Oneota stuff on it, but that's about it. So some people consider them to be upper Mississippian, meaning both, really kind of double meaning that they're in the upper Mississippi Valley, but also that they're later in time. So I hope that answered your question well enough. Yeah, they're confusing to me, and I'm not really sure who their descendants are thought to be. I don't, it's not at all clear to me.
Does anybody else have any questions? Oh, there's another one in the chat.
Was migration more overland or by the river? And were there specific adaptations to the cold weather of winter? I don't think I have a map in there that's going to quite answer that question, but they're actually, oh yeah, and I did want to say that looking at comparing these maps, you see a big difference between, like, there's a huge depopulation from Mississippian period to what we call late prehistoric. And that's partly because Mississippians leave. It's partly probably because diseases are coming with European goods before Europeans ever arrive. But notice that this distribution of sites really changes late prehistoric. These people, this is all about their fur trade is around the Great Lakes. So our area is kind of depopulated. So overland, yeah, Tim Pocketot, Dr. Pocketot from University of Illinois, believes that there's a site in Lebanon. We can't quite see it. It would be off over here. So here's Cahokia. Lebanon, Illinois would be over here. And the Emerald site is, it looks like a pilgrimage site. I can't remember right the second how many mounds are found there, like 12 or something like that. But it doesn't look like people are living there. It looks like pilgrims are coming there just to do they think some kind of moon related worship. And so Tim Pocketot believes that people are actually making angel mounds in Indiana is over here somewhere. And he thinks that there is an overland route like this for pilgrims to come across the prairie to worship at Cahokia and at the Emerald site. We have historic roads. Like I think Route 3 is on an old Indian trail. Collinsville Road that goes right at the foot of Monk's Mound is effectively on an old Indian trail. I was recently, I don't have any, let me see if I stop sharing here my, well, if I look, I can't get there from here. I was at Elephant Rock, or I was at Washington State Parks, south of DeSoto, Missouri, not too long ago, where there are lots of petroglyphs there. And I was really struck by the whizzing of cars going by on Highway 21. And all of a sudden it struck me, Elephant Rock and Johnson Shut-ins in Missouri are really, that area, St. Francis Mountains, are really important places for Cahokians. They're getting their axes there, their axe material, the basalt, sorry. But it's also in granite and other volcanic stones, but it's also about the religious, it's a go there. How do you not feel in awe of the environment that you're in when you go to those places? And I have no doubt, I'm just making this up, but I have no doubt that Highway 21 is an old Indian trail. So a lot of our historic roads, and I think if you look, I did find a thing online not too long ago that looks at some of the historic roads, and I think arguing that they were built on Indian trails. Specific adaptations made to the cold weather of winter. The houses they live in are called semi-subterranean structures where you would step down inside of it, and they could be like let's say several feet deep. Okay. And they're also fairly small by our standards. I was thinking as I sat down to give this lecture, I was cold. Now I'm hot, but their houses are tiny. It's like the size of your bedroom with a sunken in floor. And so they're snug, tiny, warm little houses compared to what we're used to. So they would be really easy to heat. And I'd say that is the most excellent cold weather adaptation that you could have, besides, of course, warm furs and stuff. And there is one site, Mississippian site, that had a bunch of mink bones found on it. I have long believed that they had their own little mink coat operation going on there. Where did the Illini come from? How culturally distinct were they? I'm not sure I understand what your culturally distinct question means, but I'm going to say generally, I think they're coming from the north, and I want to say east, and they're Algonquin speakers. So when I say, I said that the Osage and these other groups are Siouan speakers, that is a language family. Algonquin speakers is actually a huge group. There are lots and lots of tribes. And so generally speaking, if you look at where those Algonquin speaking tribes come from, they are from Illinois all the way like through the Great Lakes to the East Coast, to Virginia, huge area. And I mean, culturally, I mean, they're growing a lot of the same foods. You know, you might look at them as very similar people. The big differences is that the Cahokians were a hierarchical culture, right? They have elites and non-elites, and most of these other groups coming in, yeah, they have people that have different statuses, but not the kind of hierarchy that we see at Cahokia. So they would be much more egalitarian. Does that answer your question? Okay, and then what did their boats look like? Birch bark dugout, bull boat. Okay, I was actually really hoping no one would ask. You're welcome. I was really hoping no one would ask about canoes because I'm sure, you know, Dean Klinkenberg, I see, is in here, just asked me to speak to his group, which looks like they're a bunch of kayakers. And I thought, oh God, they're going to ask me to talk about canoes and stuff. Okay, this is what I can tell you. Go look at that canoe that's in the Cahokia Mounds Museum, and it's a dugout canoe. Okay, and what I know is that you know, a dugout canoe is made by digging out the wood, right? But you can't just dig out fresh wood. You got to be able to dig it out. Burning it really facilitates, and it's going to burn better if it's a dead tree. So this is my general understanding. Yeah, they're dugout canoes. Birch bark, I don't think so. I mean, we don't have a lot of birch trees, do we? Do we have birch trees here? When I think birch bark, I think like Great Lakes. Okay, but to make a dugout, and I had a student actually do this for a senior project like 10 or 15 years ago. It was long ago. And so what he learned was, like, one, it was like impossible to move that tree. So you really want to make that dugout canoe right next to the water. Okay, that was his observation. But I guess if you dug it out where it fell, and then you had a bunch of guys to help you carry it to the water, that would be easier than him working by himself. But this is my general understanding, and I do not consider myself an expert in this by any means. You want the tree to be dead, I think, is better, so that you can burn, so you can do the digging out part, scraping. And I have the student and friends, Larry Kinsella, who've done experiments with using stone tools versus using, I think, mussel shell. You'd think that mussel shell would be a really bad idea, but I guess it works if you burned it enough. One big axe that was found, we did a field school with University of Illinois at the Grossman site out near O'Fallon 20 years ago. And there was an axe that was that big, and it must weigh like 20 pounds. And what Larry found was, you couldn't chop a tree down with it because it was really hard to do this with it. But you can do this: chop down, drag, chop down, drag. And he thought that would be perfect for making a dugout canoe. So there's one that you can see at Cahokia itself, but no, it is not Mississippian period. It's probably 500 years old, not 1,000 years old. There's one on display up at Dixon Mounds Museum. If you get up there, better check before you go, because I hear they've got the whole second floor closed down right now as they're going through and deciding whether or not to remove artifacts from display. And a friend just emailed me one that they're working on, I think up in Wisconsin or someplace where it's underwater and they're doing an underwater excavation to remove it. So the ones that I know, the dugouts that have been found, they're not 1,000 years old. They're more like 500 years old. There are accounts of the dugout canoes that that were being used like down at the Gulf Coast, the mouth of the Mississippi, that I think like 100 warriors fit in them, and they actually were so huge that they had fires going in them to keep warm. I mean, so yeah. Anyway, I don't honestly know what a bull boat is. I'm not a boater by nature. I do. I have paddled a canoe, so I'm sorry I don't know what a bull boat is. And Danielle is saying river birch are native in the region, but I can't say if those were used as much as river birch as much as the white birch. Yeah, I don't know. I've never heard of birch boats in this region. Yeah.
So not all of our volunteers are from the St. Louis area. Do you know if the Cahokia Mounds has like any of their exhibits online to look at?
No, and you know what? Here's the thing is that most of what you see in the Cahokia Mounds Interpretive Center, Cahokia Mounds is not a museum, it's an interpretive center, meaning that most of those artifacts are not real artifacts, they're reproductions. So a museum is right for housing artifacts, really, ultimately. It's not a museum, it's an interpretive center. So because most of the artifacts they have on display are reproductions, they don't have a huge online presence. I'm going to say, I mean, they have a great website. It's hugely improved over some years back, but I don't think it's got tons of pictures of artifacts. But Dixon Mounds, I'm not sure if I don't think their website's very good. Dixon Mounds really has had, you're welcome. Dixon Mounds has really had the best artifacts on display to see, but again, they're closed down right now. The St. Louis Art Museum, Ancient Americas exhibit down by the cafe. I would check that out. And I'm not going to lie, there are some really good Wikipedia articles on the red flint clay figurines and other artifacts from Cahokia.
Do you know if they have anything at the Natural History Museum in Chicago?
Oh, I've honestly only been there once, and
Okay.
I don't remember there being much Cahokian stuff. I remember they had like a Pawnee Earth Lodge or something, but I don't really remember a lot of Cahokian stuff up there. I honestly have no idea.
Okay.
But check out the St. Louis Art Museum, the Ancient Americas exhibit down in the basement.
Okay, well, if there's no more questions, thank you, Julie, for your talk, and thank you everybody for joining.
Thank you for asking me. Thanks for coming.